I smelled smoke before I saw it. Thick, black curls rising above the treetops, just past the old oak that marked the edge of my property. I was returning from a 2-day conference in D.C., still wearing my suit, briefcase in hand, when I turned the corner onto Sycamore Lane and saw the flames. My house, my sanctuary, was on fire. I dropped everything and ran. Neighbors were gathered across the street, murmuring, phones out, doing nothing. Fire trucks were already pulling away. Apparently, it had started hours ago. Total loss. A familiar shriek cut through the hum of whispers. Oh, what a shame, but maybe now you'll think twice about turning down the HOA, Mr. I'm too good for the rules. There she was, Nancy McAllister, president of the Sycamore Grove Homeowners Association. Platinum hair, permanently pursed lips, and a voice that could peel paint off a wall. She stood with her clipboard like she was judging a bake sale, not a disaster scene. I was too stunned to speak. She continued, oblivious to the fire still smoldering behind her. We told you, Marcus Weller. This community has standards. You can't live here and refuse to join the HOA. It undermines everything we've built. You think I did this to myself? I finally managed. That house was paid off. I lived there for 12 years. Nancy clicked her tongue. Well, maybe if you'd signed the covenant like everyone else, we wouldn't have needed to take action. My heart stopped. She blinked as if realizing she'd said too much. I meant the elements, dry trees, faulty wiring. I don't know what you people do in there when you're not mowing your lawn like you should. I stared at her. My grass was always trimmed. My garbage was always out on the right day. The only thing I had refused to do was sign their HOA agreement. I didn't want to be part of their little regime, and I'd made that clear. I turned to the fire chief, who was still packing up. What caused it? He hesitated. We found accelerants near the back porch, gasoline. Traces of some kind of homemade igniter near the kitchen entry. It wasn't electrical. Arson. I turned slowly toward Nancy, who was now shifting her weight from foot to foot like a kid caught stealing candy. I'm sure it was just some drifters, she said. This is why we need tighter security, which the HOA could provide if you'd supported us. I clenched my jaw. You're proud of this. She gave a tight smile. I'm proud of our neighborhood. And I won't let one stubborn man ruin it. She turned on her heel and strutted back toward her oversized SUV, satisfied. One of her lackeys, Kimberly or Kaylee or something equally fake, followed close behind. The crowd started to disperse. No one offered condolences. That was their mistake. They thought I was just some quiet guy who didn't want to cut checks to their little tyrant club. They didn't know what I really did for a living. I pulled my phone from my blazer and made a call. This is Judge Marcus Weller. I need arson investigators on site. And I want a federal agent looped in. This falls under interstate racketeering. Because what Nancy didn't know was that I wasn't just a federal judge. I had just been reappointed to the bench for a second term, and I was done playing nice. The arson team arrived less than 40 minutes after I placed the call. Unmarked vehicles rolled up quietly, but their presence was unmistakable: charcoal suits, evidence kits, and the kind of calm efficiency that only comes from professionals who have dealt with worse. I stepped aside and let them work, watching as they cordoned off the remains of my home, photographing scorched beams and tagging fragments of melted plastic near the kitchen door. Judge Weller, one of them said, approaching with a folder under his arm. I'm Agent Thorne, ATF. We've already found residue from a potassium chlorate mixture. That's not something you pick up at a gas station. They were trying to make a point, I said. He nodded. We'll treat this like organized property crime. If you've got any idea who might have pushed the match, we'll follow it. I don't need to speculate. I turned toward the row of pristine homes behind me, each one identical in its sterile perfection. Vinyl siding, imported hedges, driveways that hadn't known oil stains in years. Sycamore Grove was a neighborhood obsessed with symmetry until I moved in. Thorne followed my gaze. You think it came from the HOA? I don't think, I'm certain, and I'll prove it. He didn't argue. We'll start with camera footage, public and private. Give me a list of properties within line of sight. We'll subpoena everything." As he walked off, I noticed Nancy standing behind her wrought iron fence, arms crossed, sunglasses on now as if the evening sun was too offensive for her delicate sensibilities. She was flanked by 2 other HOA board members. All of them had that same artificial calm, the kind that only appears when people think they've gotten away with something. "Afternoon, Judge," called one of them. A man I recognized as Dennis Halpern, the HOA treasurer. "Hope you're not planning to accuse anyone without evidence. That'd be slander." I stepped onto the sidewalk, slow and steady. "I'm well aware of the distinction between slander and libel," I said. "And don't worry, Dennis, I'm not accusing you." "Yet, sounds like a threat," he said, but his voice faltered. "You can't just walk around making assumptions." "No assumptions here, just timelines. You'll be pleased to know the ATF found potassium chlorate, homemade incendiary, probably mixed in a garage. Maybe even one with a spotless HOA-mandated epoxy floor." Nancy's jaw tightened, but she didn't speak. I kept walking. My temporary housing came courtesy of a friend from law school, an old brick duplex on the other side of town. Not nearly as polished as Sycamore Grove, but it had charm. And more importantly, no HOA. Within 48 hours, the forensics report confirmed what we suspected. The ignition source was a delayed chemical trigger made from household items, placed deliberately under the back deck. Traces of nitrile gloves were found nearby. And most importantly, one of the security cameras on Maple Drive just outside the subdivision had caught a black SUV turning out of Sycamore Grove at 3:14 a.m. Mere minutes before the fire started. I didn't need to guess who owned that SUV. I had been watching Nancy's vehicle for years. She always parked it at the edge of her driveway, as if the extra 5 feet made her more important than her neighbors. The plates matched. I sent the footage to Agent Thorne. Within hours, they had a warrant. The arrest didn't happen publicly. Federal agents rarely do things that way. But by the end of that week, Nancy McAllister was in custody, along with Dennis Halpern and a woman named Teresa Knox, who apparently handled HOA communications. The charges were serious: conspiracy to commit arson, destruction of property, and racketeering under the RICO Act. Because this wasn't just about a fire, it was about a pattern. Underneath the HOA's polished veneer was something far uglier. A paper trail had already begun to emerge. Over the past 5 years, they'd systematically targeted residents who opted out of the HOA or opposed fee hikes. Those people had seen their homes vandalized, their mail tampered with, and in 2 cases, their pets poisoned. Most wrote it off as coincidence. One elderly couple even moved to Florida after their garage mysteriously collapsed during a remodel. Now it was clear, those weren't coincidences. They were warnings. Agent Thorne met me again at the field office the following week. He looked tired but satisfied. "We pulled their servers," he said. Found internal emails between Nancy and Dennis referencing uncooperative elements and enforcement actions. They even kept notes on who was likely to fold under pressure. And the board members, 3 more are under investigation. So far, only one's flipped. The others are lawyering up. I leaned back in the chair, my fingers laced behind my head. This is going to be bigger than a neighborhood dispute. It already is. The state attorney general is opening a civil rights case. Turns out they've been denying permits selectively, manipulating property valuations, and even altering meeting minutes. And the arson charge, we've got enough. Nancy's fingerprints were on the ignition kit. Dennis bought the chemicals using his personal credit card. Sloppy? I nodded slowly. They thought they were untouchable. Thorne gave a dry chuckle. They were, until they burned down the wrong house. Word spread quickly. Local news picked it up first: a quiet federal judge's home destroyed in a suspected HOA-orchestrated arson. Then the national outlets followed, especially when the RICO charges were announced. Suddenly, Sycamore Grove became a symbol of overreach, of suburban tyranny run amok. Neighbors who once stood silently across the street now scrambled to distance themselves. Statements were issued. Petitions circulated to dissolve the HOA entirely. The ones who'd once parroted Nancy's rules now claimed they'd always had doubts. I didn't care about the apologies. I cared about the records. I filed a motion in federal court to seize the HOA's internal archives under asset forfeiture. Not just for my case, but for the others they'd hurt the families who'd suffered in silence. The judge approved it. Within days, moving trucks pulled up to the HOA's office building a converted model home, and agents removed computers, filing cabinets, and over 200 storage boxes. Everything was cataloged. Everything was preserved. The most damning piece came from a handwritten ledger Dennis kept. It listed names, property addresses, and coded notations. FJ, force join, NC, no compliance. T1 through T3, target levels, next to my name T3, the highest level. Meaning full removal. Public outrage exploded. The mayor addressed it in a press conference, urging calm while promising reforms. The city council scheduled an emergency vote to review all HOA regulations citywide, but I wasn't finished. I submitted a personal lawsuit against the Sycamore Grove HOA for damages structural, emotional, and punitive. Not because I needed the money, but because I wanted it on record. I wanted every insurance company, every real estate firm, every city planner to see what unchecked power could do. And I wanted future HOAs to think twice before threatening anyone, especially someone like me. 3 weeks after the fire, I returned to the ashes of my home. Not out of grief, but to meet a demolition crew I'd hired myself. I watched them clear the charred remains, haul away debris, and level the lot. Then I handed them a new blueprint, something different, no fences, no manicured shrubs, just a modest craftsman-style home with a wide porch and solar panels, and on the front edge of the lawn a sign, no HOA. Ever? Not a warning, a promise. 2 months after the arrests, I walked into courtroom 5 wearing the same suit I'd worn the day I saw my house in flames. It was no longer about property or neighborhood disputes. This was now a full-blown federal case under the Organized Crime Control Act. The United States vs. Sycamore Grove HOA. The courtroom was packed. Left side filled with press and a few suburban onlookers who, for the first time, wanted to see what their HOA had really been doing behind closed doors. Right side filled with attorneys, paralegals, and members of the HOA board, those who hadn't yet been indicted, but were clearly sweating. I took a seat behind the prosecution table not as counsel, but as a material witness. My role in the bench had been temporarily reassigned so I could testify without conflict. A small price to pay for what was coming. Assistant U.S. Attorney Lena Corwin stood and addressed the court. Your Honor, what we have here is not a petty neighborhood dispute. This is a pattern of calculated intimidation, fraud, and violence carried out by a group that believed they were entitled to absolute control over anyone who lived within their subdivision's bounds, regardless of legal standing. They used their authority not to protect property values, but to silence dissent. She turned slightly, motioning to the evidence table where 3 sealed boxes sat labeled with case tags. In these boxes are over 200 internal memos, surveillance photos taken without consent, coded threat assessments, and financial records showing misappropriation of dues totaling over $800,000 across 6 fiscal years. These were not volunteers managing landscaping. These were criminals running a racket under the pretense of community standards. Dennis Halpern refused to lift his eyes. Teresa Knox sat stiffly, her fingers clutching the edge of her chair. And Nancy, flushed and rigid, stared straight ahead, her expression neutral but her hands trembling slightly. When I was called to the stand, the courtroom hushed. I took the oath, adjusted the mic, and met Lena Corwin's gaze. Judge Weller, she began, can you describe the events leading to the fire at your home on April 4th? I returned from Washington, D.C. that morning. I found my house destroyed. The fire marshal determined the cause to be arson using a chemical accelerant and a delayed trigger. The investigation found materials purchased by the defendants and evidence of motive tied directly to my refusal to join their organization. Were you ever threatened directly prior to the incident? Not in explicit terms. But there were several veiled comments from board members about non-compliance, and I had received multiple unauthorized notices from the HOA suggesting that my property posed a threat to neighborhood cohesion. She nodded. Were you aware of the HOA's internal classification system for residents? Not until the investigation uncovered it. My name was listed as a Tier 3 target. According to the decoded ledger, that designation was reserved for residents considered irredeemably non-compliant. The notes beside my entry included the phrase, "removal by any means necessary." The room stirred at that. Even the judge looked visibly taken aback. "Thank you, Your Honor," Lena said. "No further questions." The defense attorney approached. A lean man with expensive cufflinks and a look that said he'd spent more time negotiating settlements at golf courses than inside actual courtrooms. Judge Weller. "You're a federal judge, are you not?" "Yes." "Do you not think your position might have influenced the speed and intensity of the investigation?" "I didn't request special treatment. I reported a felony. The evidence spoke for itself," he paced. "But you understand that, to the casual observer, it might appear as though the full weight of the federal government came down on a neighborhood association over a disagreement." I kept my voice even. "It wasn't a disagreement. It was an act of arson, followed by the discovery of a years-long pattern of criminal intimidation, fraud, and targeted harassment. If the weight of the law is too heavy for the guilty, that's not the law's fault." He paused. No further questions. After my testimony, the prosecution called former HOA Secretary Grace Lund. She'd turned witness in exchange for immunity. Her voice trembled, but what she revealed made the courtroom go still. "They had a list," Grace said. "Every board meeting, they'd go through it who hadn't paid dues, who questioned the rules, who didn't attend events. Nancy would mark them in red if she thought they were a problem, and then she'd assign actions." "What kind of actions?" Lena asked. Sometimes it was fines, fake ones. Other times it was more, breaking sprinkler heads, filing noise complaints that weren't real. Once they poured bleach on someone's flower beds because he hung an American flag without the official HOA-approved bracket. And were these actions discussed openly during meetings? Yes. Dennis would say things like, "We need to make an example," and Nancy would smile and say, "Let's see how long they last." The judge ordered a recess shortly after that. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had formed. Reporters angled for statements. I said nothing. I didn't need to. The evidence was already doing the talking. Back at my temporary home, I reviewed the most recent filings from my civil suit. My attorneys had uncovered a shell account used by the HOA to funnel funds into personal expenditures, spa retreats, private vehicle maintenance, and even campaign donations to local candidates who promised to protect HOA privileges. That last one caught my attention. I made a call to a contact in the State Ethics Commission. Within days, a formal inquiry was opened into 3 council members linked to Sycamore Grove's board. The rot went deeper than anyone thought. Meanwhile, the City Council passed a temporary moratorium on new HOA charters within city limits. For the first time in decades, municipalities were reasserting authority over neighborhoods that had operated like sovereign fiefdoms. The HOA's legal team tried to stall the civil suit, claiming the criminal proceedings took precedence. But my attorneys filed a motion to sever the cases, citing irreparable harm and immediate need for restitution. The court agreed. During discovery, we obtained a recording from one of the board's private meetings captured by a former member who'd grown uneasy with their tactics. In it, Nancy is clearly heard saying, "If we can't control them, we'll drive them out, burn it down if we have to." She wasn't speaking metaphorically. The jury never stood a chance. After a 6-day deliberation, the verdict came in, guilty on all counts. The sentencing was swift. Nancy received 22 years, Dennis 17, Teresa 15. The rest took plea deals and were barred from holding any fiduciary or governing roles for life. But the real moment of catharsis came not in court, but at the next city council meeting. I stood at the podium, not as a judge, but as a resident. We've allowed unchecked authority to grow in our neighborhoods under the guise of order. What we've discovered is that these associations, when left without oversight, can become something far more dangerous. They can become governments unto themselves, answerable to no one. That ends now. The chamber erupted in applause. 2 weeks later, the last vestige of Sycamore Grove's HOA was erased. The association was dissolved, its assets liquidated and distributed to residents who had been wronged. The HOA office was converted into a public park space, and the lot where my home once stood, construction was nearly finished. The frame now had a roof, windows installed, and the porch beams stained a deep walnut. Across the street, a new neighbor moved in, a young couple with a toddler and a dog that barked too much. They brought over a pie. "We heard what happened," the man said, shifting nervously. "Just wanted to say we're glad someone stood up. Most people would have just moved." I shook his hand. "Well, I'm not most people," he grinned. "Clearly." As they walked back across the street, the dog tripped over its leash and sent the toddler into a giggling fit. For the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. No clipboards, no secret meetings, no coded threats. Just neighbors being neighbors. And a home, rebuilt not just with wood and nails, but with resolve. No organization would ever control this street again. Not while I lived here. The final inspection on the new house had just wrapped up when I got the call from Lena Corwin. "They're offering a deal," she said, voice clipped, irritation just barely restrained. "Nancy's attorney wants to plead down the racketeering charge in exchange for cooperation against the city officials who accepted HOA-funded campaign contributions." I walked to the edge of the porch, watching the contractor's van pull away. The paint was still drying on the front door, a deep green, the same color as the tie I'd worn the day I was sworn in the first time. The irony wasn't lost on me. "They'll throw the city council under the bus if it means shaving a few years off," I said. "And if they're that desperate, they've got more to give." Lena was silent for a beat. "You're probably right. I'll push for a proffer session. No promises, no deal unless they cough up something we don't already have." "Keep me updated," I said. "And send me the transcripts when you get them." I hung up and glanced across the street. The new neighbors were outside again, setting up a raised garden bed. Their daughter toddled around holding an empty watering can, chasing the dog's tail like it was a living balloon string. Everything looked normal, honest. It made the next part easier. That evening, I drove across town to the old records annex behind City Hall. The building was half forgotten, a relic with cracked bricks and mismatched blinds. Inside, I met with Joel Simmons, a city compliance officer who'd called me after reading the final docket sheets from the HOA trial. He handed me a manila folder without speaking. Inside were blueprints and transfer forms dating back over a decade, all stamped with the Sycamore Grove HOA's seal. But what caught my eye was a single note scrawled in faded ink across the bottom of a 2012 land use document. Expedited variance for Parcel 17B per informal agreement with HOA. No public review. Parcel 17B was my lot. I looked up. "What's this?" Joel scratched at his beard. "It's illegal." That's what it is. They pushed through a zoning exemption without city approval, used it to block you from applying for solar permits back in 2017. The file was buried. Took me 2 weeks to find it. They sabotaged infrastructure approvals. Worse. They logged you as a temporary resident in one section. That's why your requests kept getting denied. They never had the legal authority, but someone upstairs let it slide. I exhaled slowly. How many others? At least 9 properties. Anyone who didn't sign onto the HOA in the early years. They were marked as in transitional status. It's not a real designation. They made it up. He handed me a second folder. "I've already submitted this to the Ethics Commission, but I thought you'd want a copy." "How long have you worked here?" I asked. 15 years, he said. "And I've never seen anything like this." They had half the planning board on speed dial. I thanked him and left, my mind turning faster than it had in weeks. The civil case had already closed. The criminal case was mostly wrapped, but this was a new layer altogether. Administrative fraud, falsified zoning documents, and a conspiracy to restrict public utilities. And the kicker: those solar applications they blocked. I'd found a 30% federal credit waiting for me when I finally refiled. The only reason I qualified now was because the HOA had been dissolved and the false records scrubbed. That night, Lena sent me the transcript from Nancy's proffer. In it, she described biannual strategy dinners held at a private wine bar downtown. Attendees included HOA board members, 2 city planning officials, and a former real estate appraiser who'd been quietly delisted 2 years prior for manipulating valuations. At these dinners, they discussed which residents were low-yield or non-conforming and how to apply pressure without attracting legal scrutiny. She named names. She even provided receipts. By the end of the week, the district attorney had filed charges against 2 former city officials and opened a corruption investigation into the planning department's review process. It was bigger than I ever imagined, and it wasn't over yet. The following Monday, I stood outside the newly renovated community center, the same building that once served as the HOA's headquarters. The city had repurposed it into a public library branch and neighborhood forum space. The nameplate above the door was temporary, but the name wasn't. Weller Civic House. I hadn't asked for that. The neighborhood did. Inside, residents gathered for the first town hall meeting since the HOA's dissolution. No mandatory attendance, no fines, no dress code. Just people, plumbers, teachers, postal workers, retirees sitting in folding chairs and passing around coffee urns. I took the podium at their request. "Some of you knew," I began. "Some of you didn't, but all of us were affected, and now it's over." A few nods. A few tired smiles. But the real fight isn't about one HOA. It's about the machinery that lets people like that operate unchecked. It's about the loopholes, the blind spots, and the silence that built a system around fear. I unfolded a piece of paper. This is a draft of the Sycamore Protection Ordinance. It proposes mandatory transparency for any neighborhood governance body, public auditing of dues, and a resident recall mechanism. If you want to bring it to City Council, I'll help you write it. If you want to submit it as a citizen petition, I'll sign it. Hands started going up before I finished. After the meeting, a man in a maintenance uniform approached me. He looked familiar, but it took a moment to place him. He'd once been fined for mounting a basketball hoop on the side of his garage. I remembered the HOA had claimed it violated the aesthetic integrity of the roofline. He held out a small envelope. "Found this in my mailbox last year," he said. "Didn't open it until after the trial, thought you should have it." Inside was a typed letter, unsigned. It read, "Judge or not, if you don't fall in line, we'll remind you how replaceable structures are. Fire cleanses." I folded it carefully and handed it back. "Keep it," I said. "It belongs in the archive," he smiled. "Glad you stayed. So am I." In the weeks that followed, the ordinance passed with a supermajority. Several developers across the state began reevaluating their HOA clauses. A few even dropped them entirely, citing liability concerns. One morning, I received a letter from the State Bar Association, not for complaint, but commendation. They were launching a task force to review legal frameworks surrounding private neighborhood organizations. I was asked to chair it. I accepted. On the first real spring day of the year, I stepped onto my porch with a cup of coffee and looked out at a street no longer ruled by pettiness or fear. The air smelled of cut grass and charcoal. Someone was grilling nearby. Someone else was playing piano with their windows open. The notes floated over the rooftops like a promise. No more secret boards, no more rigged meetings, no more fires, just homes, mine among them, safe, legal, and finally truly mine.